So against this background, this atmosphere of leadership turmoil in the public gaze, and by now real personal animosity, can you describe the swirls in the economy that were confronting you?
Yes, well, see, Kerry, Australia's a commodity-based country, and we'd had, as we've discussed, this long secular decline in the terms of trade, the value of the things we sell compared to the value of the things we buy, from about the middle 1960s. And in 1986, when it took the big fall down to the depression levels, that's when I made the Banana Republic remark to turn it. But then the roller coaster of the terms of trade unexpectedly took us back up. Commodity prices started lifting again. So through 1988, you've got rapidly rising commodity prices. Actually, if you see it on the Reserve Bank commodity chart these days, it's a V. Down in 87, up in 88. So with this big loss of national income, then big surge of national income, any government's battling to try and hold it all together. Now, on top of that, we had the following things. We had the biggest investment surge in 30 years. That had come because of the real reduction in real wages, and the reduction in real wages and the lift in the profit share, one. Two, the general confidence in the business community about the Labor government as it had moved to surplus. So it's in surplus and it's got a high profit share. So investment's really taken off. As well as that, the newly deregulated banks are lending like fury against the foreign banks.
A lot of it bad lending.
Yeah, some of it badly in the end, yes, agreed. But it's an explosive cocktail of demand. So what the economists call GNE, gross national expenditure, rose by 11% that year. You know, so in other words, there's an enormous income shock coming from exports, there's an enormous investment shock, and there's a housing and construction boom as well.
We know now that a nasty recession was slowly moving on Australia like a malevolent storm front through this whole period. While the gods fought out their personal ambitions, looking back now, had you only been concerned about your day job, not angsting about leadership or personality conflicts, might you have seen that recession coming with a little more clarity?
Well, as you know, it's a matter of record. I wanted interest rates to rise in 88 faster than the Reserve Bank moved them up. But the Reserve Bank had in mind the stock market crash of late 87 and the advisings from the Bank of International Settlements about a coming massive 1933 type stock market implosion. So the bank wanted to leave conditions accommodating, softer, lower interest rates. My judgment was that the economy had just gone over it like a pothole, that the demand the massive demand had just run over the stock market hole like a pothole, and that demand was taking off. So, but we were also trying to develop an independent Reserve Bank. So it was not like the old days pre-float where I could sort of ring the governor and say, look, Bob, I think you better shove the rates up. I had to go with the bank board and the bank's officers and the bank board, and the officers and the board didn't move the rates up till May 88. Then only ever so quietly and by little. By that stage, the demand boom was off and running. It was by the end of 88, it was a house on fire.
But didn't you, in terms of that growing independence that you were fostering at the Reserve Bank, didn't you at some point say of the Reserve Bank, they do as I say, which implied the absolute opposite?
No, people misunderstood that. What I said was, look, in economic, I said I have the Reserve Bank on side, or I forget the expression. What I meant was we can affect fiscal policy, the budget, interest rates, the Reserve Bank, wages through an accord. In other words, we're an economy equipped with tools. That's what I was really trying to say.
Paul Kelly says that Bob Johnson, with whom you had a close relationship, was appalled by those comments, they do as I say, and didn't know whether to correct you publicly or resign. Did you two ever have a conversation about that?
No, I said, Bob, look, I think I said to him, look, you know what he said, I know what you're trying to say, that we've got all the arms of policy ready and working. I said, yeah, well, I could have chosen the words better. I think he regarded that as a kind of an apology. and he was happy to carry on. But that's what I did mean. You see, Kerry, in the actual operation of monetary policy under me, relations between us were entirely proper. In fact, this is an expression Bob Johnson used in his last speech. He said, "I must say that relations between the Labor government and myself and the bank and its board over the period have been entirely proper." And they were. And not only that, I liked Bob Johnson and he liked me. So we were great pals, and I was never to embarrass him or do anything. I was really trying to say, look, we've got a big demand boom on our hand, but don't worry, we've got the arms of policy all working. The budget, interest rates and wages, and if I hadn't have used phrases like, I've got them in my pocket or something like that, then it would have been fine, but it was fine anyway.
Yeah. Can you just take us inside that process? It was quite an intimate group, really. There was a handful of people in your office advising, and a handful of people in the Reserve Bank directly responsible and advising. So a very tight little group. Cabinet essentially was locked out of monetary policy at that stage. You would have been passing information back to Bob Hawke as Prime Minister, telling him what the thinking was. But can you just take me inside that process as you guys deliberated over months and months, all the figures jumping up and down, going in ways you weren't expecting?
That's right. Well, under the Reserve Bank Act instructs the Treasurer and the Governor and the Board to endeavour to agree. So the Reserve Bank Act obliges the Governor and the Treasurer to endeavour to agree.
But presumably in reality, within those bounds, you're having some pretty frank conversations.
No, but I'm just saying, and notwithstanding the fact we've now moved to a floating regime, that when the Reserve Bank Act was set up, we had an old managed exchange rate system. We're now in a floating system, but nevertheless the Reserve Bank Act doesn't change. So civility and sense demands anyway that you try and run the place cooperatively, and of course we did. And so when we would have a policy meeting, we'd have the Governor, the Deputy Governor, the Assistant Governor, and we would have the Treasury Secretary often, and the person running general financial policy, and myself and my private office. It was a little group, I mean not so little, 6 or 7.
And these were very regular meetings?
Sort of they were generally monthly, built around each Reserve Bank board meeting.
Now again, in the Broad, over 15 months through this period, interest rates went up by about 6%. Huge hit to I would have thought to the economy in particular ways. 6% in 15 months. You must all have been stumped, really. Treasury, Reserve, you, your office, the Cabinet, not to mention the broader economic community, watching interest rates go up at that rate, but still not seeming to have an effect.
No, well, the demand was just so strong. I mean, it was the biggest boom in 20 years or something like that, just an enormous boom. And nothing seemed to sort of slow it down, you know. And the other thing was, of course, we had the current account deficit and the balance of payments. And this, you know, is a big story. This is where the Treasury always, and so did the bank, believed in the twin deficits theory. That if you cut government spending by, in this case, 2.5% of GDP, you would cut the current account deficit by 2.5% of GDP. I had at that stage changed the budget balance by nearly 7% of GDP, from a deficit of 4.7% of GDP to a surplus of 2.5. So the changeover was 7%. So you would think if the government's affected a 7% reduction in the call by the government sector on Australian savings, the current account would at least drop by 2.5%, but it didn't. And the reason it didn't is because all the savings that I'd freed up through fiscal policy were all chewed up by business in their big investment cycle, right? So if all things had been the same, the current account would have come down, but all things were not the same. Business was so buoyed up by the Labor government at the time, so buoyed up and so confident about it, it just invested its head off.
In early 88, you wanted a 2% increase in interest rates. You thought it needed to be a little bit on the blunt side.
Yeah. In 88, I wanted the bank to put the rates up by a big number and say so. Do you know, in this period, Kerry, asset prices, housing prices were rising 20 to 25%. 20 to 25%. And I wanted the Reserve Bank to say, hey, this is going to stop. But instead of that, it took them till May to move it up half a percentage point, and then they didn't announce it. They should have risen in February. And they moved up, I think the first point was half a percentage point. It should have been 2, and we should have announced it. So in the end, you see, the Treasurer is in the new system somewhat hostage to the RBA.
Now, John Phillips, the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank at that time, who was part of all of those discussions, he has subsequently said that he remembers no difference of view amongst you at that time.
Oh, yes, it was. I mean, in the end, Russell was ringing, Don Russell, my private secretary, was ringing every week, saying to Phillips, John, when are you going to put the rates up? You know, we've agreed at the last two board meetings to put them up. They're not up yet. And I finally got to the point. I told David Morgan, I said if...
So Dave Morgan was the Treasury person
officer,
responsible for monetary policy.
I said, if Johnson and Phillips don't put the rates up soon, I will I will actually give them a parliamentary instruction to do it.
You said that?
Yeah, I'll use the provisions of the Reserve Bank Act to give them a parliamentary instruction to do it. I'm not.
Can you remember what he said?
And he said, oh, well, I don't think we have to get around to that, Treasurer. I said, look, I can't take this obfuscation any longer, David. I mean, if all this stuff with John's going on about snugging and keeping the rates down, I said, the place is on fire.
But are you saying you were muzzled as Treasurer by an Act of Parliament from even saying that, from giving those kinds of indications?
Unless the board basically agreed, I couldn't go out there and announce changes that the board didn't. I mean, this is all the cost of the Reserve Bank's growing independence. I mean, we're pleased now. I mean, I've got the scars all down my back. I had to have the word Reserve Bank tattooed into me, turning what was a bond-selling agency of the Treasury into an independent central bank. But part of it was I couldn't be in that at the same time, take over monetary policy when it suited me.
I know the late John Button, as Industry Minister, always had his ear to the ground across a range of business. That was his job. He later said he felt very isolated through this period, that he was constantly hearing very depressing messages from businesses and unions, and was treated as a bit of a gloom merchant. Now, I can remember him saying at the time, in discussions around the place, I can remember him saying he was deeply worried. He believed Australia was headed for recession. Yeah. Do you remember that?
I do, but, you know, when the party does get overheated, it's hard to take the punch bowl away, and that's what we were doing. So you had to have the asbestos suit on, the rates were rising, the cash rate was at 17%, because the economy was on fire. So, and the bank, for the reasons we've just discussed, was slow getting up there, so they just had to stay higher longer.
In May 89, in the context of what John Button was saying, in May 89, you were still arguing that high interest rates wouldn't push the country into recession.
Yep, because both the bank and the Treasury particularly the Treasury thought there would be a much softer landing. This was not the bank's view, by the way. Ian McFarlane, who was the Assistant Governor and had the head of research, took a view that we'd have a harder landing than the Treasury did.
And he was right.
It turns out he was right.
But where were you in that, between the soft landing and the hard landing?
I didn't know, really. It's very hard to pick it. I mean, where did the problem come from? It came from the terms of trade, fundamentally. It came from the big roller coasters, down in 97 and up in 88. You know, it's like, you know, you see those shows, those Western cowboy shows with the bucking bronco. That's what the economy was. It was the bucking bronco, you know.
In June 89, you received a report from your Joint Economic Forecast Group telling you that the next year's current account, that's 1990's current account, was going to be worse than it was in 89, and they couldn't identify the timing of a slowdown. These were your forecasters, and you wrote on that forecasting report, quote, "Noted with thanks, it makes the twin deficit theory look like bullshit."
Yeah.
This was the theory you'd come to rely on in setting policy to control the boom and avoid the bust.
Exactly.
How did you feel at that moment?
Well, I got sold a bill of goods by the official family about the twin deficits theory.
Well, saying a bill of goods suggests that they kind of vaguely knew it was a bill of, I mean, it's like...
No, they believed in the... Look, the orthodoxy is if you wish to reduce your call on overseas savings and overseas debt, which is reflected in the current account deficit, you lift your own savings. And one of the ways you can lift your own savings is taking the government out of the savings pool. In other words, taking the government demand out. I changed the budget balance by 7 percentage points of GDP, yet the task I'm trying to do on the current account is 2.5 to 3. So I've done two to 2.5 times the task, yet the current account still didn't improve. The reason for that was the Treasury didn't pick the massive boost in investment. So all the dollars I'm freeing up in the budgets are being used by Australian business.
But you know, I've got vivid memories of you. You know, one of the abiding images of Paul Keating through those years as Treasurer that every journalist I'm sure would agree, and many members of the public, is this man who revelled in painting an image of himself as the man who loved painting on the big canvas, the man who loved pulling the policy levers. This was very much part of your act at the time.
Sure.
But the irony, of course, is, I mean, that was more image than reality as it turned out through this period.
Well,
you might have been pulling levers, but they weren't working.
Well, the fact is, I was very proper with the bureaucracy, very proper. As Bob Johnson so eloquently said in his final goodbye speech, relations with this government have been entirely proper. This was true of my relationship with the Treasury.
But I'm thinking more when I'm bringing that image up. I'm thinking more about the kind of image that you struck with the broader electorate, and that is an awful lot of people marked you down as arrogant. This man who presented himself as being in command of everything, when in fact, in the recession, it's not so much that you had clay feet, but you certainly weren't in command of everything.
Well, I couldn't be in command of a big boom in commodity prices, and I couldn't be in command of a big boom in investment.
But was that the price you were paying for the image you painted for yourself in the electorate?
Oh, well, Kerry, people confuse pride in one's craft with sort of arrogance or picture framing. Unless you have pride in the craft and you are conscientious in the task, moving these big national aggregates, I mean, that's why they'd never moved for all these years. Nobody used to take this stuff on. You know, it's all too hard, put it under the carpet. I did it, but it's after the stock market crash, then the boom in '88, you know, arguments in the official family about whether we ought to keep conditions soft or not. Very hard for the Treasurer to say, no, I have all the answers. You know.
Well, there were times that people might have believed that you were saying you had all the answers.
Well, I had a few.
So how hard was it in that climate to frame the 1989 budget for August of that year?
Oh, it was pretty difficult. Yeah. The budget that year, I think we had, because the big thing I had to do was put tax cuts in to stop another wage explosion. Let me just labour that point for a second. The whole system, because the demand was about to blow again, just like 1981 too. We would have just lost the whole battle of inflation and a decade lost. So Bill Kelly...
There was a sense that wages were going to explode. Explode,
yeah. In fact, Bert Evans at the MTIA said, "There she blows." You know, the whalers phrase, "There she blows." He thought it was all going to blow away.
And he was the spokesman for the whole of the manufacturing sector in Australia.
He was. Effectively, he was. And Bill Kelty's trying to hold the damn wall back, and he needs me to help him. So what's he need? He needs big tax cuts. So I give him $30 tax cuts in the 1989 budget, and he gives me a reduction. He sticks to wages growing at 7%, not 12 or 13 or 14. I mean, just to give you an idea, at the Shell refinery in Melbourne, I remember Bill calling me to say that the Shell company had offered the workers in the refinery in Melbourne that year wage increases of 15%. 15. Now, just imagine what that would have done to the inflation rate.
Well, so, and that there would have been a flow on potentially other unions
to the whole economy. So what would have happened was what I needed the ACTU to do was say, no, we won't take the money. Now ACTUs don't do that. We won't take the money. We'll only take half the money. We'll take 7%. because that Mr Keating's going to give us $30 tax cuts in lieu. In other words, if we keep the discipline of 7, he'll give us $30 a week off his surplus.
Now, of course, one of the criticisms subsequently of your handling of the recession was that tax cut fanned the flames.
Oh, good now, yeah, but what, look, that's just, you know what that argument is? Trash argument. Had I not allowed Kelty to hold the damn war back, we would have been back to 1981 too. I mean, those tax cuts were completely necessary. Otherwise, see, wages grew that year 7%, Kerry. Otherwise, it would have grown at 14 or 12, and the tax cuts, and I had the surplus. So essentially, the 1989 budget was about holding the game together. You know, that is keeping the thing fundamentally that Bob and I had put together from '83.
Well, it was certainly the budget that Peter Walsh came to Bob Hawke and said, "I've had enough. I can't go on anymore." But just come back to that note that you wrote on one of the pages of your newspaper archive. The toughest 3 months of this whole period. Just try and put yourself back in that mindset in terms of your emotional, your physical state.
Yeah. Well, remember, the previous year I presided over the big May statement with the tariff cuts and then the budget in surplus in 1988. And then we'd had the Kirribilli carry on, etc. And Bob and I had to get back down to the task. Meanwhile, the economy's still booming away. The wages system's about to blow its brains out. And what I've got to do is try and convince... See, in the DNA of a lot of union secretaries and officials was you take the money. If the shell company's offering you 14%, you take it. Not refuse it, take it. So after 6 years of wage restraint, when Bill Kelty would go to trade unions, they'd say, "Oh, Bill, go away." You imagine, Bill had been preaching wage restraint since the 83 summit. 83, 84, 85, 86, 87, 88 and 89, the jackpots arrived and the companies are handing out 12 and 13%. And going to them again saying, no, don't take the money. Let's agree with the government and do 7% for wages because that nice treasurer will give us $30 tax cuts. They said, "Oh, Bill, tell it to the Marines, tell it to the Marines." So he had a big job holding the wages system together in 89-90, and so did I. And that's what sort of ran the... And of course the cabinet, I mean, these are well-intentioned people, but...
And bright people, mostly.
And bright people, but 6 or 7 years of this massive juggling to get the structural aggregates, to get the inflation rate into some sort of order, to keep a wage system that's sort of starting to be consistent with a low inflation rate, at the same time starting to get investment restarted, get more growth. You see, by 1990, the economy had been growing at 4% for 5 years. 4% for 5 years.
Now, also around
it used to grow at 1.7.
John Edwards wrote just before the 89 budget that support for your policies of high interest rates and deep cuts was vanishing within a caucus that was facing an election within a year. Among economic commentators and the business community, the discord within Canberra was interpreted as a sign that Keating was losing control over economic policy. Can you remember the speech you gave saying you wouldn't be bothered by tricks and baubles or spooked by economic ratbaggery? You weren't bothered by the nervous Nellies of the backbench.
Yeah. You
were in charge.
Yeah.
Did that have the desired effect?
It did. Well, what happened was they all started to sort of wet their pants. That's what happened. They wanted, here's one, Keating resists push for mortgage relief. Richardson and people like that were telling Bob, look, we've got to make housing mortgage deductible like the Americans do. Now, you know how tax-preferred Australian housing is. It's not capital gains taxed. Imagine the sort of society we'd have if interest was deductible, right? But this was a big push. So I had to knock that one down. Then finally it says the government to stick with Keating's policies. That's July 89. That's after I did the so-called Menzies Hotel speech saying ratbaggery is out. The government has a strong, rational policy in place. Yes, things are testy, interest rates are high, the boom is still not yet subsiding, but we're not going to sort of wet our pants and go for ratty policy, So they stuck with me. Then Bob came back from Paris Hawke takes up the Keating line, in other words, Richardson goodbye. Despairing Labor looks to Keating for a boost of morale. That's July 1089.
So, the end of 89, you're facing an election, as it turned out, in March of 1990, and by the end of 89, the Reserve Bank and you were in agreement that the boom was effectively over. What policy consequence was there of that?
Well, it was then about getting the bank to lower the interest rates. And Bernie Fraser took over from Bob Johnson during this period, and Bernie wanted to keep the board together, and there was one recalcitrant, if I could use that word, member of the board. There was a guy called Gordon Jackson. He was the former managing director of CSR. He used to always get around in a black three-piece suit. I used to say to Bernie, he looks like a bad priest. Anyway, this guy would not agree to reduce the interest rates. And I said to Bernie, just knock this joker over. Oh no, Treasurer, I've got to keep the board together. I think part of my job is to keep. I said, yeah, keep it. What? We'll have the economy burning to keep Gordon Jackson happy? I said, Bernie, cut it out. Cut it out, you know. Cut it out. At any rate, Bernie got the better of them, but not until January 90. It's not till January 90 that the first interest rate reductions start. But, you know, we get there. Here it is here. Keating eases the screws, January 24, 1990.
Was there no political consideration about that election in your conversations with Bernie Fraser about pulling rates down?
Oh, God, there'd be a bit, of course. But I didn't want the economy burning. And then this is the killer point. See, business, this is the financial review. Business falls in with Labor's wages strategy. In other words, business is saying, thank you, Mr. Kelty and Mr. Keating, we agree with you. We don't want a wage explosion and we don't want to go back to 1981. And you know, when you've got Labor and when you've got business, you win.
So
we had to beat Peacock, but we have the business community and we have organised Labor, right? That was my job, to assemble the forces. So I assembled them for Bob for March 1990.
Interest rates tumbled through 1990, but it was too late. In November of that year, you fronted the press gallery with the declaration, this was the recession Australia had to have.
Yeah.
You've lived with it ever since, haven't you?
Well, I have, but again, let me live with the 22 years of growth and low inflation that followed. Okay, there's a deal. I'll live with it, but give me the credit for 22 years of low inflation and a flexible wages system thereafter, and setting up the economy for a nearly quarter century run.
Well, let's just, acknowledging that, let's just stay with the bubble of November 1990, of that moment in time. This comment was not driven by the instincts of the Bankstown boy in touch with the public mood, was it? Perhaps more clever wordsmith, with the love of the metaphor and the clever turn of phrase.
Yeah, I know, but I did. This is a point of dispute with Bob and me, where there is in fact no dispute. I didn't use the phrase without checking it with him, and I went round to see him with Don Russell, and Don Russell has a clear note of Bob saying, "Well, Paul, if you think that's okay, if you think that explains where we are, I'll leave that to you." In other words, he didn't say, "Oh, no, don't use those phrases." Now, in his book, he says, "Oh, no, this was all Keating's doing." Let me be clear about this. I'm not blaming Bob for it, and I'm not putting it onto Bob. It was my phrase. But he was agreeable to me using it. And the reason he was that it was a recession we had to have, because had we not had it, wages would have been back to 1981 again. Now, would I have liked a softer landing? Yes. Would I have liked that sort of Reserve Bank to have put the rates up earlier in 1988 and got them down quicker in 1990? Yeah, 89, yes.
But in those terms, it wasn't the recession you had to have if the levers had been pulled correctly. If you, the Reserve and the Treasury had been acting in accord,
well, that's if
then and I know there's a lot of ifs there, and I know it's said with hindsight, but nonetheless, if the right levers had been pulled, if you and the Reserve and the Treasury were all able to agree in your judgments, then technically the recession was avoidable.
Might have been avoidable, because we still had G&E, gross national expenditure, rising by 11% that year. We had a huge turnaround in commodity prices, the terms of trade. We had a massive investment boom. House prices in Sydney and Melbourne were rising by 20 to 25%. Just imagine how bad that is, 20 to 25%. I mean, what sort of country can survive that? Wages about to blow their brains out, and banks lending like fury. You see, I'm not sure, Kerry, you can say that, you know, there's a little vernier dial that the Reserve Bank has and the Treasury has, and we tweak it a little bit here and a little bit there, we'll get, ooh, a nice little soft landing for you. If that was the case, you wouldn't hear about recessions in the United States or in Europe or in Japan. If everyone could do it that easily, there would be no recession anywhere.
But you see, in your education of the greater Australian public about how economies work, you'd led us to believe that all you had to do was precisely that, just pull the odd lever.
Well, that's called good salesmanship.
Perhaps too good in this instance.
Maybe.
After all those long debates with policy advisors, within your party, various stakeholders around the place in the years leading up to and including the recession, in the end, the buck stopped at your desk. What responsibility, ultimately, do you take for that recession?
Well, I think you've got to take responsibility for the outcomes. You know, I take responsibility for, even though there was an independent Reserve Bank, and in the end they were, too slow up and too slow down, and the bronco effect of the terms of trade, this is just the hand you're dealt. And I think if you're the Treasurer, you have to take responsibility for it.